The following two videos are still my favorite presentations from Bernardo Kastrup. In the first, he refutes materialism, and in the second, he defends metaphysical idealism, the notion that all of reality is basically consciousness. These two very robust presentations answer most of the questions that come up for people on this topic, so I do urge you to start here. But then in the original 2020 course, we followed on with 2 weeks of open Q&A and discussion, which led to some of the most profound and personal conversations that I've ever been privileged to witness. And these were so successful that we've continued to do this twice a year. Meet with Bernardo for 4 or 5 weeks, ask questions, get into discussions, and also include guests such as Michael Levin, Federico Fagin, Christopher Wallace, Rupert Spira, and coming up in November 2024, the celebrated neuroscientist Christoph Koch. So if you enjoy these discussions and you want to join us, discuss these with Bernardo Kastrup and quite an amazing community of meditators, mystics, philosophers, scientists, and simply ordinary people who are very curious about reality. You can find us in the links below or at adventuresinawareness.com. You can also hugely support this channel by hitting like, subscribing, and sharing your thoughts, questions, and reflections in the comments section below. So, welcome to week 1 of this course, Bernardo Kastrup with Reality in Mind. My name is Amir. I'm curating and recording this course. Feedback, questions, structure, how we're organizing ourselves, and you can let me know. And I just want to quickly introduce today's video. This is a recording of the first course that we did. So what we realized is we don't want Bernardo to have to go back over everything he's already said. We've recorded it. It's better if anyone new just watches this recording, and then we can dive deeper in together into the material. And there are 5 questions that I want you to keep in mind when you watch this, which will help guide your attention. So the first is, what is materialism? Okay, so a lot of people believe things just because that's what everyone else around them believes, but never really questions even, never mind do they believe it or not, they don't even question, what does this belief mean? What does it even say? So materialism is the kind of incumbent, as we mentioned, reigning metaphysical worldview of reality in science and in our culture. So just get really clear with yourself, what does materialism claim? So Bernardo's going to go into that. The second question I recommend you keep in mind is, what's the difference between science and philosophy? So Bernardo takes a decent amount of time explaining what the differences are, what science is good for, what philosophy is good for, and why it's important not to conflate or confuse one with the other. The third question, so you may have heard of the hard problem of consciousness. I really recommend you go and Google that, the hard problem of consciousness, if you've never heard of it before. And what you should be able to answer by the end of this first week of the course, if not by the end of the video, then we can engage Bernardo in that question a little bit more, of why is that problem neither hard nor a problem? You know, how does Bernardo see through that problem? Fourthly, what is parsimony and why is it important in metaphysics? So people who understand this question really go a long way to understanding what Bernardo's trying to say. So keep that question in mind, and when he starts to go into it, see if you can understand why, out of all the criteria that he talks about for being, for understanding what a good metaphysical framework of reality is, this one is the most important. And finally, towards the end of the presentation, he'll go into what are the arguments against panpsychism. So see if you're able to answer that by the end of the video, and if you're able to do that, then you're really getting into the subtleties of the argument of, like, why is one metaphysical proposition better or distinct from another. And it might seem subtle to begin with, but it does really change how you see reality, how you see yourself. So yeah, we're going to dive straight in. I really recommend you watch every video that's sent out in its entirety before we go together. Jot down your notes, jot down your questions, keep them in mind so we can share them together. And just to say that I think lots of people go through life maybe ignoring, maybe not being interested, you know, who knows, certainly not engaging with me when I ask these questions. You can't just get annoyed. So I consider you a soulmate if you're motivated and curious enough to book onto a course where we can hold ourselves in this question for 4 weeks together. Then I'm excited to meet you, I'm excited for the conversations that come out of this, and I really hope you get as much out of engaging with this philosophy as I have.
So the plan for the first part of this course funny enough, it's not to talk about idealism, but it is to talk about materialism, which is the reigning worldview in our society, in our culture. It's the worldview that sort of underlies a lot of scientific work that is done. The accurate name for this worldview would be the metaphysics of mainstream physicalism. And the reason is materialists say now that, well, it's not only matter in the way that was understood by Democritus. We are now talking about fields and, you know, and particles that represent force, and these things are physical. So physicalism is the better name. Fine. I will still use the word materialism here because this is not a technical audience, and I think it has more appeal to make more clear what I mean. And I also mean metaphysical materialism, not materialism as a set of values, like, well, if the material girl likes to buy shoes and have big houses, well, that's not metaphysical materialism, that's ethical materialism. That's not what I'm talking about, even though one seems to underlie the other, because if all there is matter, then it's hard to see another purpose for life other than to accumulate matter, because it's all there is. But strictly speaking, we are talking about metaphysics in this course. So first part, it is about materialism as the incumbent, so to say. What is it? What are its mistakes? Why it is probably the worst metaphysical option that we have on the table today. To motivate what I'm going to be talking about, I want to convince you first that even militant materialists do not understand what materialism is, especially the ones that aren't philosophers. The militant materialist philosophers tend to know, but the spokespeople of science tend not to know, and this leads to ludicrous situations. So it's very, very important to start from a correct understanding of what materialism entails and implies. To give you an example, famous militant materialist Jerry Coyne, in writing, has said a couple of things to me that betray a drastic lack of understanding of materialism. And that's probably why materialism is so popular, because people don't understand how absurd it is. One thing he has written on record is this: any sensation in animals, be they bacteria or humans, involves some sort of qualia. In other words, some sort of experiential quality. For example, what does it feel like to the crustacean Daphnia, or water flea, most of you would call it a water flea, to detect a predatory fish in its pond? Now, he's talking about not only water fleas, but bacteria as feeling things, as having experiential states, having phenomenal states. Now, a bacterium is a unicellular organism. It does not have a nervous system. According to materialism, a single cell cannot be conscious, cannot have experiential states, because experiential states are supposed to emerge as an epiphenomenon, a sort of side effect of particular complex arrangements of matter that are much more complex than a single bacteria. So right at the start, Jerry Coyne already contradicts materialism, and he is unknowingly and very naively endorsing some form of panpsychism or idealism. He's basically saying that you do not need complex material arrangements for phenomenal states or experiential states to arise. They are there from the bacteria on, and he's associating that with life, which is precisely analytic idealism. It's precisely my version, my theory, if you will, about what's going on. Localized consciousness is associated with life at all levels, all kinds of life. But he is, in principle, ostensibly defending materialism with this statement. Another one: I have never heard a definition of materialism that requires quantitative measurement. But that's Kastrup's definition, and it seems to be one he's confected to rule out consciousness as a material phenomenon, or the result of a material phenomenon. So basically what he's saying is that qualities, experiential states, are not epiphenomenal, because that's what materialism says. Materialism says that all that exists is matter. And matter is exhaustively defined in terms of measurable quantities: mass, charge, momentum, space-time position, frequency, amplitude, whatever. And there is nothing left after you've described matter with quantities. There is nothing left to be said about it. That's the definition of matter under materialism. It does not entail qualities of any kind. The qualities are epiphenomenal. They emerge out of certain complex arrangements of matter, according to materialism. So here he's contradicting materialism again while trying to defend it. So interesting and funny and entertaining as this is a very serious thing. It's not comic because it's tragic. It is this kind of drastic misunderstanding of what's going on, even of what we say is going on, that underlies a multitude of errors in philosophy, in science, and in daily life, because these ideas largely guide how we feel about life. They guide what we perceive to be the meaning of our lives, the worth of our lives. Even if we don't think they are doing that, they are doing that subliminally, because we are getting this message from culture, from the media, from our friends, from the teachers, everywhere. And what is supporting this is a comical level of misunderstanding and error. So let's try to get it straight what materialism is all about. What materialism says is that, I don't know whether you can see my mouse. I hope you can. It's a little laser pointer here. Amir, can you see my laser pointer on the screen?
Yeah, we can.
Okay. So what materialism says is that the qualities we experience, like this multitude of colors here on a chair and a table. So in the world of tables and chairs, there are qualities like colors, like melodies, like flavors, like textures, and so on and so forth. Materialism says that all these qualities that we associate with the world of tables and chairs out there are actually generated by our brain inside our skull. And they only exist within our skull. They don't really exist out there at all. They are not fundamental. They are secondary. They are side effects. They are epiphenomenal. They are generated by our brain. What is really out there is an arrangement of atoms, a purely abstract arrangement of elementary particles, which you cannot visualize. Because if you visualize something, any visualization, even the simplest visualization, the moment you do that, you're bringing qualities into it. And according to materialism, there are no qualities out there. Qualities only exist in here, inside our heads. So you can't even visualize this world of fundamental elementary subatomic particles out there. And importantly, according to materialism, you will say everything there is to be said about this world, this abstract world out there, if you provide a suitable list of quantities that characterizes it. Physical quantities like mass, charge, momentum, geometric relationships, frequencies, amplitudes, and so on and so forth. If you pin down that complete list of quantities, then you have said all there is to be said about the abstract world that is supposedly beyond our skull. We do not have direct access to it because we are locked within our own minds, and our mind happens entirely within our skull. So you can even play with the implications of this. If you go out at night, a clear sky night, and you look up to the sky and you see those beautiful stars. According to materialism, the stars that you see, the qualities that you associate with the visible stars, their color, their luminance, their arrangement, is happening and exists inside your skull. The inner surface of your real skull is beyond the stars you experience when you look up to the sky at night. That's what materialism is saying. Your entire world, the room that you see around you, the streets that you see through the window, all that, the people you see around you, all that exists within the boundaries of your skull, because all that is experiential. There is something out there, according to materialism, that corresponds to the stars you see, that corresponds to the room you see around you, to the street you see out the window, to the people you see around you. There is something out there that corresponds to it, but it is not the people, the room, the stars, the street, as you experienced them. All those experiences are ostensibly, putatively, within the boundaries of your skull. Even when you see your head, when you see your skull reflected on a mirror, that face, that skull, that head you see is merely an experiential representation of something that is out there, but to which you have no access. It's a sort of a little representation of your real skull unfolding within your real skull, which you, by definition, have no direct access to. You only have access to its representation, which is engendered, created by your brain. I'm repeating myself a lot because over the past 10 years I've been doing this. I noticed that it takes time for people to really internalize, for people to absorb really what this means. We are so used to thinking that, well, we are materialists, when in fact we are not at all. Because if we would really explore what materialism entails and implies, we would think, hey, wait a minute, that's not what I believe in. I believe that the qualities of the world are really out there, that the world really has colors, really has melodies, really has flavors. I believe that the stars I see up in the sky at night are really beyond my head and not within my head. Well, if that's what you think, you are not a materialist. It's important to get these things straight. Let me go to the next slide. If there are questions, this is a good moment. If anybody has a question.
So just to remind everyone, if you have a question, you should have a Q&A box down the bottom, and you can just pop your question in there, and at certain points Bernardo will pause and I'll read them out. But so far, there are no questions.
Okay. Let me go to the next slide. If I can move to the next slide. Next. Okay, I think I've talked about this already, but it's good to go over it again. According to materialism, the world that you experience around you, the world of experience is within your skull. Your entire life, as far as you experience it, is putatively unfolding within your head. So this brings us to another very interesting implication of materialism, a way to contemplate what it actually is. Look at what's happening here. We start from the world of experience. The colors, the forms, the flavors, the textures that we perceive to be out there. That's the starting point, even of science. When science took its first baby steps in the early 17th century, scientists began from their perceptions of the world out there, the objects and the events of the world they perceived. And of course, perception is qualitative. Perception is mental in nature. You perceive red. You don't perceive X hertz of electromagnetic vibration. But you describe red with a certain frequency number, or and a amplitude number of electromagnetic field oscillations. So scientists themselves started from the qualities of perception, and they discovered over time that it was very handy, very convenient to describe those perceptions, to describe the objects and events on the screen of perception through quantities, because quantities could capture the relative differences between perceived qualities. For instance, if you would lift, as a scientist, a heavy piece of luggage, like luggage was back in the 17th century, you would have a certain feeling, a certain qualitative experience of weight, of lifting a heavy weight. And if you would lift a feather, you would have a different qualitative experience of weight. Through quantities, it was very convenient to describe the relative differences between these two experiences of weight. Heavy weight and light weight, the difference would be captured with a number in a unit that we call newtons. not kilograms. Kilograms is mass, not weight, but I'm not going to get into that detail. If you get confused, then just think of kilograms. It's not quite accurate, but it will be. So this idea of quantities arose as a handy way to describe qualities, especially relative differences between qualities. And that had sparked the scientific revolution, because science is about observing what is on the screen of perception, describing it with quantities, and then based on those quantities, creating predictive models of nature's behavior. You use quantities to predict what nature will do next, and that's what enabled technology and the 21st century. In a nutshell, the history of the last 4 or 5 centuries. But then at some point, something very weird has happened. We have replaced the starting point, the qualities on the screen of perception. We've attempted to replace it with its description. We've granted reality to the description, and we withdrew the reality of that which is described in the first place. So now we say that matter, which is defined fully, exhaustively in terms of quantities, we say that matter is all that exists. In other words, all that exists is the description, the quantities, the numbers, the weights, the masses, the amplitudes, the frequencies. Now we say that's what really exists. And what was described in the first place, the qualities on the screen of perception, now that is secondary. That is epiphenomenal. That is reducible to the quantities. So this, in a nutshell, is it is quite equivalent to a painter who paints a self-portrait and then points at it and says, I am that. I am the self-portrait. Because the self-portrait is a description of something. And when you replace that which is described with a description of it, you find yourself in the exact same situation of the painter that paints a self-portrait and says, I am it. And then that painter has to explain his entire phenomenal inner life, his entire experiential inner life, his feelings, his emotions, his thoughts, the qualities of his perceptions. He has to explain all that in terms of patterns of pigment distribution on canvas, because he is reducing himself to his self-portrait. In other words, he has to explain everything about himself in terms of his self-portrait, which is illogical, it's absurd, it inverts the arrow of description. And that is exactly what we are trying to do under materialism. The self-portrait is matter, quantitative descriptions of the world, the qualitative world of perception. And then we try to explain the qualities of perception in terms of matter, which is entirely equivalent to trying to explain yourself in terms of your self-portrait. Good luck with that. That's the origin of the so-called hard problem of consciousness. We defined matter in a way that explicitly excludes qualities. That's how we've defined matter. And now we try to reduce qualities to matter. We try to explain qualities in terms of that which excludes qualities by definition. Do you see what's happening here? This is not a real problem, let alone a hard one. It's an artificial question. It's a confusion of thought. We got ourselves confused very early on, and that mistake stuck, and we are living with it to this day. I see there are questions popping, so maybe it's a good time to answer them.
Yeah, for now I'll just go in the order that they were. So Josh asking, does this point to the inability of materialism to breach the explanatory gap?
Absolutely. It's a problem that materialism has created for itself. Because remember the little story I just told you, we start from qualities. Then we discover that quantities are useful to describe relative differences between qualities. Then we make the ludicrous step of granting reality only to the description and not to that which is described. Sorry, I moved one ad. It was not my intention. And then we create the explanatory gap by having made this movement of thought that is absurd once you examine it carefully. So the explanatory gap, it's not something that exists out there. The hard problem of consciousness is not a problem that exists out there. It's an artifact of bad thinking. That's essentially what it is.
And maybe just for anyone who doesn't know the explanatory gap, it looks like that might be the next slide anyway, you're going to get to.
Yeah, I don't remember, but I'll get back to that, to the hard problem of consciousness. Yeah.
Covered, yeah. So is it fair to say that we have confused the territory with the map?
Completely. We take the map for the territory now. Now we say that the map is all that exists, and the territory somehow arises from the map. That's that's the explanatory gap right there for you. We are failing to explain or to reduce the territory to the map. We are failing to make sense of how there can be nothing to the territory other than what is on the map. We're never succeeding that because it's an artifact of an error.
But with science, the description has drastically altered the human experience. For example, scientific advances. How do we reconcile that?
I don't see a conflict at all. I think descriptions are extraordinarily useful. We have advanced enormously as a civilization because our descriptions of nature are so accurate now. Not only the descriptions, but the predictive models that you can build on top of those descriptions. Because if you describe what is, you can anticipate what will be. Assuming that the underlying mechanisms of your description will hold going to the future. And empirically, we know that that is the case. We have extremely good empirical reasons to believe that's the case, even though logically, there is nothing that enforces it. There's nothing that fundamentally guarantees that the laws of nature a minute from now will be the same as now. It just happens that this has been the case for a long time, so we take it for granted that it will continue. So descriptions are very valuable, very useful. I'm not against descriptions. I'm not against maps. I go walking in the mountains every year to places where I'm out of reach of the emergency services, literally, for hours out of reach. I trust the maps. I carry them with me. I wouldn't be doing what I do when I go to the mountains if I didn't think there was value to the maps, in the same way that there is value to the descriptions of science. All I'm saying is that when you say that all that exists is the map and the mountains are not there, that's clearly a mistake. And materialists are saying that standing on the mountain. They're standing on the mountain with the map in their hands and they're saying the mountains don't exist, it's only the map. I think that's an error.
So questions come in. Can you explain
essentially on to be the structure of the perceiver, of the subject of perception. Now, this logical bridge is arbitrary, so panpsychism is sort of motivated by an arbitrary bridge. We've also discussed why panpsychism entails an insoluble problem comparable to the hard problem of consciousness.
When it's quiet, that's when it hits you. That's what I think. That's what a lot of people experience when they come back from a conflict zone. You know, the everything that was life and death, everything that mattered, all the noise, all the chaos, all the people that are around you that would die for you, kill for you, you would kill for them. All the millions of dollars worth of equipment and stuff like that you were responsible for now are all gone, and it's just you.
The following is a conversation with Ed Calderon, a security specialist who has worked for many years on counter-narcotics and organized crime investigation in the northern border region of Mexico. I highly recommend you follow the writing and courses on his Patreon and website, edsmanifesto.com. This is the Lex Friedman Podcast. To support it, please check out our sponsors in the description. And now, dear friends, here's Ed Calderon. What does your experience in counter-narcotics, investigating the Mexican drug cartel, teach you about human nature?
Wow. I mean, first off, anybody can be got. Anybody can be corrupted. You know, you work in that field, and you realistically, the training we got and profiling and investigation and stuff like that was basically you learn from the older guys there, and some of those guys were already corrupted from the start. So trust no one. I remember seeing that X-Files episode where that was stated. You quickly learn that even if you are somebody that to your own mind appears incorruptible, you know, small changes happen around you, wheels get greased, money gets put in front of you, and or things get threatened, like your life, and sometimes a payment for some.
Imagine lying in bed, the weight of the day slowly fading as your mind begins to drift. In those quiet moments, your thoughts wander, reflecting on the journey of your life, the choices you've made, and the endless possibilities that lie ahead. What if, instead of falling into the usual cycle of worry and overthinking, you could immerse yourself in the calming, timeless wisdom of ancient philosophy? Imagine letting the teachings of Stoicism, Taoism, and existential thought lull you into a state of introspective peace, helping you to release the anxieties of the day and embrace the gentle flow of existence. Philosophy isn't just for academic halls or intellectual debates.
It's a guide for navigating the human experience, and it offers a profound balm for a restless mind. The wisdom of Marcus Aurelius teaches us resilience and the art of inner peace. His reflections remind us that much of our suffering is born from our own perceptions, our attachment to outcomes, and our resistance to the natural course of events. As you listen to his words, imagine releasing the burdens you carry, letting go of the need to control what lies beyond your grasp. In this way, Stoicism becomes a comfort, encouraging you to accept each moment as it is and to let go of what you cannot.
Its direction. The wind's velocity determines whether a flight is delayed.
Imagine lying in bed, the weight of the day slowly fading as your mind begins to drift. In those quiet moments, your thoughts wander, reflecting on the journey of your life, the choices you've made, and the endless possibilities that lie ahead.
A glove maker and local merchant, and Mary Arden, who came from a respected farming family. Their home on Henley Street was modest, but comfortable, filled with...
Imagine lying in bed, the weight of the day slowly fading as your mind begins to drift. In those quiet moments, your thoughts wander, reflecting on the journey of your life, the choices you've made, and the endless possibilities that lie ahead.
In science, for hundreds of years, that space-time is fundamental reality. In the last 10 years, for the first time, scientists have taken off the space-time headset. What are we going to find? So I should be very, very clear on this point. Now, I'm a cognitive neuroscientist, and when I say that space-time isn't fundamental and objects in space-time aren't fundamental, that means neurons don't exist when they're not perceived. What I'm saying is very, very uncomfortable, that we don't see reality as it is.
Whatever reality is, it's not what you see. What you
of Cognitive Sciences at UC Irvine. The following is a conversation with Donald Hoffman, professor of Cognitive Sciences at UC Irvine, focusing his research on evolutionary psychology, visual perception, and consciousness. He's the author of over 120 scientific papers on these topics, and his most recent book titled The Case Against Reality: Why Evolution Hid the Truth from Our Eyes. I think some of the most interesting ideas in this world, like those of Donald Hoffman's, attempt to shake the foundation of our understanding of reality, and thus they take a long time to internalize deeply. So proceed with caution. Questioning the fabric of reality can lead you to either madness or the truth. And the funny thing is, you won't know which is which. This is the Lex Fridman podcast. To support it, please check out our sponsors in the description. And now, dear friends, here's Donald Hoffman. In your book, The Case Against Reality: Why Evolution Hid the Truth from Our Eyes, you make the bold claim that the world we see with our eyes is not real. It's not even an abstraction of objective reality. It is completely detached from objective reality. Can you explain this idea?
Right, so this is a theorem from evolution by natural selection. So the technical question that I and my team asked was, what is the probability that natural selection would shape sensory systems to see true properties of objective reality? And to our surprise, we found that the answer is precisely zero, except for one kind of structure that we can go into if you want to. But for any generic structure that you might think the world might have, a total order, a topology, metric, the probability is precisely zero that natural selection would shape any sensory system of any organism to see any aspect of objective reality. So in that sense, what we're seeing is what we need to see to stay alive long enough to reproduce. So in other words, we're seeing what we need to guide adaptive behavior. Full stop.
So, the evolutionary process, the process that took us from the origin of life on Earth to the humans that we are today, that process does not maximize for truth, it maximizes for fitness, as you say. Fitness beats truth. And fitness does not have to be connected to truth, is the claim. And that's where you have an approach towards zero of probability, that we have evolved human cognition, human consciousness, whatever it is, the magic that makes our mind work, evolved not for its ability to see the truth of reality, but its ability to survive in the environment.
That's exactly right. So most of us intuitively think that surely the way that evolution will make our senses more fit is to make them tell us more truths, or at least the truths we need to know about objective reality, the truths we need in our niche. That's the standard view, and it was the view I took. I mean, that's sort of what we're taught, or just even assume. It's just sort of like the intelligent assumption that we would all make. But we don't have to just wave our hands. Evolution by natural selection is a mathematically precise theory. John Maynard Smith in the 70s created evolutionary game theory, and we have evolutionary graph theory and even genetic algorithms that we can use to study this. And so we don't have to wave our hands. It's a matter of theorem and proof, and or simulation before you get the theorems and proofs. And a couple of graduate students of mine, Justin Mark and Brian Marion, did some wonderful simulations that tipped me off that there was something going on here. And then I went to a mathematician, Chetan Prakash and Manish Singh, and some other friends of mine, Chris Fields. But Chetan was the real mathematician behind all this, and he's proved several theorems that uniformly indicate that, with one exception, which has to do with probability measures, there's no the probability is zero. The reason there's an exception for probability measures, so-called sigma algebras or sigma additive classes, is that for any scientific theory, there is the assumption that needs to be made that whatever structure, whatever probabilistic structure the world may have, is not unrelated to the probabilistic structure of our perceptions. If they were completely unrelated, then no science would be possible. So this is technically the map from reality to our senses has to be a so-called measurable map. It has to preserve sigma algebras. But that means it could be infinite to one, and it could collapse all sorts of event information. But other than that, there's no requirement in standard evolutionary theory for fitness payoff functions, for example, to preserve any specific structures of objective reality. So you can ask the technical question. This is one of the avenues we took. If you look at all the fitness payoffs from whatever world structure you might want to imagine. So a world with, say, a total order on it. So it's got n states, and they're totally ordered. And then you can have a set of maps from that world into a set of payoffs, say from 0 to 1,000 or whatever you want your payoffs to be. And you can just literally count all the payoff functions. You just do the combinatorics and count them. And then you can ask the precise question, how many of those payoff functions preserve the total order, if that's what you're doing, or how many preserve the topology? And you just count them and divide. So the number that are homomorphisms versus the total number, and then take the limit as the number of states in the world, and the number of payoff values goes very large. And when you do that, you get zero every time.
Okay, there's a million things to ask here, but first of all, just in case people are not familiar with your work, let's sort of linger on the big, bold statement here, which is the thing we see with our eyes is not some kind of limited window into reality. It is completely detached from reality, likely completely detached from reality. You're saying 100% likely. Okay, so none of this is real in the way we think is real, in the way we have this intuition. There's like this table is some kind of abstraction, but underneath it all there's atoms, and there's an entire century of physics that describes the functioning of those atoms and the quarks that make them up. There's many Nobel Prizes about particles and fields and all that kind of stuff that slowly builds up to something that's perceivable to us, both with our eyes, with our different senses, as this table. Then there's also ideas of chemistry that over layers of abstraction, from DNA to embryos to cells that make the human body. So all of that is not real.
It's a real experience, and it's a real adaptive set of perceptions. So it's an adaptive set of perceptions, full stop. We want to think that
Perceptions are real.
So their perceptions are real as perceptions, right? They are. We are having our perceptions, but we've assumed that there's a pretty tight relationship between our perceptions and reality. If I look up and see the moon, then there is something that exists in space and time that matches what I perceive. And all I'm saying is that if you take evolution by natural selection seriously, then that is precluded. That our perceptions are there. They're there to guide adaptive behavior, full stop. They're not there to show you the truth. In fact, the way I think about it is they're there to hide the truth because the truth is too complicated. It's just like if you're trying to, use your laptop to write an email, right? What you're doing is toggling voltages in the computer. But good luck trying to do it that way. The reason why we have a user interface is because we don't want to know that quote unquote truth, the diodes and resistors and all that terrible hardware. If you had to know all that truth, it would, your friends wouldn't hear from you, right? So what evolution gave us was perceptions that guide adaptive behavior, and part of that process, it turns out, means hiding the truth and giving you eye candy.
So what's the difference between hiding the truth and forming abstractions, layers upon layers of abstractions over low-level voltages and transistors and chips and programming languages from assembly to Python that then leads you to be able to have an interface like Chrome where you open up another set of JavaScript and HTML programming languages that lead you to have a graphical user interface on which you can then send your friends an email. Is that completely detached from the zeros and ones that are firing away inside the computer?
It's not. Of course, when I talk about the user interface on your desktop, there's this whole sophisticated backstory to it, right? That the hardware and the software that's allowing that to happen. Evolution doesn't tell us the backstory, right? So the theory of evolution is not going to be adequate to tell you what is that backstory. It's going to say that whatever reality is, and that's the interesting thing, it says whatever reality is, you don't see it. You see a user interface, but it doesn't tell you what that user interface is, how it's built. Right now we can try to look at certain aspects of the interface, but already we're going to look at that and go, okay, before I would look at neurons and I was assuming I was seeing something that was at least partially true. And now I'm realizing it could be like looking at the pixels on my desktop or icons on my desktop, and good luck, going from that to the data structures and then the voltages, and good luck. There's just no way. So what's interesting about this is that our scientific theories are precise enough and rigorous enough to tell us certain limits, and even limits of the theories themselves. But they're not going to tell us what the next move is, and that's where scientific creativity comes in. So the stuff that I'm saying here, for example, is not alien to physicists. The physicists are saying precisely the same thing, that space-time is doomed. We've assumed that space-time is fundamental, but we've assumed that for several centuries, and it's been very useful. So all the things that you were mentioning, the particles and all the work that's been done, that's all been done in space-time, but now physicists are saying space-time is doomed. There's no such thing as space-time fundamentally in the laws of physics. And that comes actually out of gravity together with quantum field theory. It just comes right out of it. It's a theorem of those two theories put together. But it doesn't tell you what's behind it. So the physicists know that their best theories, Einstein's gravity and quantum field theory put together, entail that space-time cannot be fundamental, and therefore particles in space-time cannot be fundamental. They're just irreducible representations of the symmetries of space-time. That's what they are. So space-time, so we put the two together. We put together what the physicists are discovering, and we can talk about how they do that. And then the new discoveries from evolution and natural selection. Both of these discoveries are really in the last 20 years. And what both are saying is space-time has had a good ride. It's been very useful. Reductionism has been useful, but it's over. And it's time for us to go beyond.
When you say space-time is doomed, is it the space? Is it the time? Is it the very hard-coded specification of 4 dimensions? Or are you specifically referring to the kind of perceptual domain that humans operate in, which is space-time? You think like there's a 3D, like our world is 3-dimensional and time progresses forward, therefore 3 dimensions plus 1, 4D. What exactly do you mean by space-time? What do you mean by space-time is doomed?
Great. So this is, by the way, not my quote. This is from, for example, Nima Arkani-Hamed at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, Ed Witten, also there, Gavin Gross, Nobel Prize winner. So this is not just something the cognitive scientists, this is what the physicists are saying.
Yeah, the physicists are space-time skeptics.
Yeah, they're saying that, and I can say exactly why they think it's doomed, but what they're saying is that, because your question was, what aspect of space-time, what are we talking about here? It's both space and time, their union into space-time as in Einstein's theory. That's doomed. And they're basically saying that even quantum theory, this is Nima Arkani-Hamed especially, so Hilbert spaces will not be fundamental either. So that the notion of Hilbert space, which is really critical to quantum field theory, quantum information theory, that's not going to figure in the fundamental new laws of physics. So what they're looking for is some new mathematical structures beyond space-time, beyond Einstein's 4-dimensional space-time or supersymmetric version, geometric algebra signature 2,4 kind of. There are different ways that you can represent it, but they're finding new structures, and by the way, they're succeeding now. They found something called the amplituhedron. This is Nima and his colleagues. The cosmological polytope. There are these like polytopes, these polyhedra in multi-dimensions, generalizations of simplices, that are coding for example, the scattering amplitudes of processes in the Large Hadron Collider and other colliders. So they're finding that if they let go of space-time completely, they're finding new ways of computing these scattering amplitudes that turn literally billions of terms into one term. When you do it in space and time, because it's the wrong framework, it's just a user interface. That's now from the evolutionary point of view. It's just user interface. It's not a deep insight into the nature of reality. So it's missing deep symmetry. It's something called a dual conformal symmetry, which turns out to be true of the scattering data, but you can't see it in space-time. And it's making the computations way too complicated because you're trying to compute all the loops and Feynman diagrams and all the Feynman integrals. So see, the Feynman approach to the scattering amplitudes is trying to enforce two critical properties of space-time: locality and unitarity. And so when you enforce those, you get all these loops and multiple, different levels of loops. And for each of those, you have to add new terms to your computation. But when you do it outside of space-time, you don't have the notion of unitarity. You don't have the notion of locality. You have something deeper, and it's capturing some symmetries that are actually true of the data. But then when you look at the geometry of the facets of these polytopes, then certain of them will code for unitarity and locality. So it actually comes out of the structure of these deep polytopes. So what we're finding is there's this whole new world now beyond space-time that is making explicit symmetries that are true of the data that cannot be seen in space-time, and that is turning the computations from billions of terms to one or two or a handful of terms. So we're getting insights into symmetries, and all of a sudden the math is becoming simple because we're not doing something silly. We're not adding up all these loops in space-time. We're doing something far deeper. But they don't know what this world is about. So they're in an interesting position where we know that space-time is doomed, and I should probably tell you why it's doomed, what they're saying about why it's doomed. But they need a flashlight to look beyond space-time. What flashlight are we going to use to look into the dark beyond space-time? Because Einstein's theory and quantum theory can't tell us what's beyond them. All they can do is tell us that when you put us together, space-time is doomed at 10 to the minus 33 centimeters, 10 to the minus 43 seconds. Beyond that, space-time doesn't even make sense. It just has no operational definition. So, but it doesn't tell you what's beyond. And so they're just looking for deep structures, like guessing. It's really fun. So these really brilliant guys, generic, brilliant men and women who are doing this work, physicists, are making guesses about these structures, informed guesses, because they're trying to ask, well, okay, what deeper structure could give us the stuff that we're seeing in space-time, but without certain commitments that we have to make in space-time, like locality. So they make these brilliant guesses, and of course, most of the time you're going to be wrong. But once you get one or two that start to pay off, and then you get some lucky breaks. So they got a lucky break back in 1986. A couple of mathematicians named Park and Taylor took the scattering amplitude for 2 gluons coming in at high energy and 4 gluons going out at low energy. So that kind of scattering thing. So it's like, apparently for people who are into this, that's sort of something that happens so often you need to be able to find it and get rid of those because you already know about that and you need to. So you needed to compute them. It was billions of terms. And they couldn't do it, even for the supercomputers couldn't do that for the many billions or millions of times per second they needed to do it. So they begged, the experimentalists begged the theorists, please, you got it. And so Park and Taylor took the billions of terms, hundreds of pages, and miraculously turned it into 9. And then a little bit later, they guessed one term expression that turned out to be equivalent. So billions of terms reduced to one term, that so-called famous Park-Taylor formula, 1986. And that was like, okay, where did that come from? What? This is a pointer into a deep realm beyond space and time, but no one, I mean, what can you do with it? And they thought maybe it was a one-off, but then other formulas started coming up. And then eventually Nima Arkani Hamed and his team found this thing called the amplituhedron, which really sort of captures the whole, a big part of the whole ball of wax. I'm sure they would say, no, there's plenty more to do. So I won't say they did it all by any means. They're looking at the cosmological politics as well. So what's remarkable to me is that 2 pillars of modern science, quantum field theory with gravity on the one hand, and evolution by natural selection on the other, just in the last 20 years have very clearly said space-time has had a good run. Reductionism has been a fantastic methodology. So we had a great ontology of space-time, a great methodology of reductionism. Now it's time for a new trick. But now you need to go deeper and show, but by the way, this doesn't mean we throw away everything we've done, not by a long shot. Every new idea that we come up with beyond space-time must project precisely into space-time, and it better give us back everything that we know and love in space-time, or generalizations, or it's not going to be taken seriously, and it shouldn't be. So we have a strong constraint on whatever we're going to do beyond space-time. It needs to project into space-time. And whatever this deeper theory is, it may not itself have evolution by natural selection. This may not be part of this deeper realm. But when we take whatever that thing is beyond space-time and project it into space-time, it has to look like evolution by natural selection, or it's wrong. So that's a strong constraint on this work.
So even the evolution by natural selection and quantum field theory could be interfaces into something that doesn't look anything like you mentioned. I mean, it's interesting to think that evolution might be a very crappy interface into something much deeper.
That's right. They're both telling us that the framework that you've had can only go so far, and it has to stop. And there's something beyond. And that framework, the very framework that is space and time itself. Now, of course, evolution by natural selection is not telling us about like Einstein's relativistic space-time. So that was another question you asked a little bit earlier. It's telling us more about our perceptual space and time, which we have used as the basis for creating first a Newtonian space versus time as a mathematical extension of our perceptions. And then Einstein then took that and extended it even further. So the relationship between what evolution is telling us and what the physicists are telling us is that, in some sense, the Newton and Einstein space-time are formulated as sort of rigorous extensions of our perceptual space, making it mathematically rigorous and laying out the symmetries that they find there. So that's sort of the relationship between them. So it's perceptual space-time that evolution is telling us is just a user interface, effectively. And then the physicists are finding that even the mathematical extension of that into the Einsteinian formulation has to be as well not the final story. There's something deeper.
So let me ask you about reductionism and interfaces as we march forward from Newtonian physics to quantum mechanics. These are all, in your view, interfaces. Are we getting closer to objective reality? How do we know if these interfaces in the process of science, the reason we like those interfaces is because they're predictive of some aspects, strongly predictive about some aspects of our reality. Is that completely deviating from our understanding of that reality, or is it helping us get closer and closer and closer?
Well, of course, one critical constraint on all of our theories is that they are empirically tested and pass the experiments that we... So no one's arguing against experiments being important and wanting to test all of our current theories and any new theories on that. So that's all there. But we have good reason to believe that science will never get a theory of everything.
Everything.
Everything, right, a final theory of everything, right. I think that my own take is, for what it's worth, is that Gödel's incompleteness theorem sort of points us in that direction, that even with mathematics, any finite axiomatization that's sophisticated enough to be able to do arithmetic, it's easy to show that there'll be statements that are true, that can't be proven, can't be deduced from within that framework. And if you add the new statements to your axioms, then there'll be always new statements that are true but can't be proven with a new axiom system. And the best scientific theories, in physics, for example, and also now evolution, are mathematical. So our theories are going to be, they're going to have their own assumptions, and they'll be mathematically precise. And there'll be theories perhaps of everything except those assumptions, because the assumptions are, we say, please grant me these assumptions. If you grant me these assumptions, then I can explain this other stuff. But so you have the assumptions that are like miracles as far as the theory is concerned. They're not explained. They're the starting points for explanation. And then you have the mathematical structure of the theory itself, which will have the Gödel limits. And so my take is that reality, whatever it is always going to transcend any conceptual theory that we can come up with.
There's always going to be mystery at the edges.
Right.
Contradictions and all that kind of stuff. Okay.
And truths.
So there's this idea that is brought up in the financial space of settlement of transactions. It's often talked about in cryptocurrency, especially. So you could do, money, cash is not connected to anything. It used to be connected to gold, to physical reality, but then you can use money to exchange value, transact. So when it was on the gold standard, the money would represent some stable component of reality. Isn't it more effective to avoid things like hyperinflation, if we generalize that idea? Isn't it better to connect your whatever we humans are doing in the social interaction space with each other? Isn't it better from an evolutionary perspective to connect it to some degree to reality, so that the transactions are settled with something that's universal, as opposed to us constantly operating in something that's a complete illusion? Isn't it easy to hyperinflate that? Like where you really deviate very, very far away from
This theory of conscious agents is really the first layer of software outside of our space-time headset. Once you know the software, you can change the game pretty much any way you want to.
So you believe we're living in a simulation of sorts?
I think that we just have to bite the bullet and say, no matter how smart and mathematically precise you are, it's going to be trivial compared to the reality beyond. And I think as a scientist, it's critical for me to actually spend time in utter silence. That's where the true new creativity comes from. What we know is one perspective out of an infinite number of perspectives. But that's who you are. What you are transcends any description. And that's how the infinite comes to know itself.
Don, so good to have you back.
Thank you, Andre. Thanks for having me back.
I thought we could start with giving maybe a 10-minute overview, kind of a high-level view of both your work, our conversation last time, which I absolutely loved and our audience loved. And then we can dive deeper into some new terrain here on this conversation today, which I'm very much looking forward to. So starting with how fitness beats truth.
Okay.
And how the chance that evolution has shaped sensory systems to see objective reality is precisely zero in the work that you share. Could you elaborate on that a little bit in terms of how evolution shapes our sensory systems to be able to navigate it effectively for survival purposes, but not to see reality as it is objectively?
Right. So Darwin's theory is very clear that evolution shapes sensory systems to guide adaptive behavior. And that's true. According to Darwin's theory, that is in fact true. Most of us think intuitively that to do that, evolution must shape us to see the truth, because clearly, if you see the truth, that will be much more adaptive than if you don't see the truth. So to guide adaptive behavior, evolution must also shape us to see the truth. And it turns out that that extra assumption, which isn't in Darwin's theory, shouldn't be in Darwin's theory. Now, the mathematics of it is very, very simple. The payoff functions that guide evolution. Like if you play a game, you have payoffs. If you make certain moves on the board game or in a video game, you get certain number of points, and if you get enough points, you can get to the next level of the game. If you don't get enough points in time, you die, so forth. Same thing like in evolution. There's the evolutionary game theory. You have payoffs that guide adaptive evolution. And what happens with those payoffs, they're basically not telling you whether you go to the next level of the game, but whether your genes, your offspring, go to the next level of the game. So when you analyze those fitness payoffs and ask, do those fitness payoffs contain information about the true structure of objective reality? Right? If they're going to shape you, if the payoff functions that guide evolution are going to shape your sensory systems for you to see the truth, then they have to know a little bit about the truth themselves, or they can't shape you. And what we've proven, and this is again work with not just me, but Chetan Prakash, Manish Singh, Robert Prentner, and Brian Marion, and Justin Marks, so a number of other people, not just me. What we've shown is in a number of ways that the payoff functions basically don't have the information, almost surely don't have the information about the structure of the world. So you can actually prove the probability is precisely zero that any payoff function has that information, and therefore it's precisely zero probability that we've been shaped to see reality as it is. Now, I should mention just two quick objections that people have about this. One is, I've shot myself in the foot, logically. Right? I've used evolutionary game theory, which is supposed to capture Darwin's theory of evolution. It's the mathematics of Darwin's theory. And I've used it to actually show that certain basic concepts in Darwin's theory, like real physical animals competing for real physical resources in the real space and time. I'm saying that all of that, space and time aren't fundamental. We're not seeing reality as it is. Objects in space-time are just an illusion or a headset. So the argument from philosophers, some philosophers has been, well, Hoffman unfortunately has shot himself in the foot logically. He's used evolutionary game theory and mathematics to show that the very concepts that gave rise to evolutionary game theory aren't true. So either the math faithfully represents Darwin's ideas and captures it and is a good representation of those ideas, or it's not. If it's not, Hoffman couldn't use it for what he's using it for. And if it is a good faithful representation of Darwin's central ideas, then it couldn't possibly contradict them. So in either way, Hoffman is messed up, right? and his team. And the answer is this fundamentally misunderstands the nature of scientific theories. Every theory makes assumptions. They're the miracles of the theory. And then it says, if you grant me those assumptions, I'll then prove all this or explain all this other wonderful stuff. But it never explains its assumptions. And you can get a new theory, a deeper theory that explains those assumptions, but it'll have its own new assumptions ad infinitum. So every theory has, if it's good enough, has a scope. But every theory, no matter how good it is, has its limits. If none else, its assumptions are showing you what its limits are. So the only question is, when you have a mathematical representation of the theory, is the mathematics, if it's a good theory, the mathematics will help you explore the scope. That's new. But if it's a great theory, the mathematics will actually show you precisely what the limits are. And in case of Einstein's theory of space-time, for example, his mathematics is, of course, fantastic, and GPS and everything else is based on Einstein's math. So wonderful scope. But his theory also, the same mathematics that captures his theory and shows its scope, also tells us its limits. And the limits are, in Einstein's case, 10 to the minus 33 centimeters. Space-time ceases to have any operational meaning. 10 to the minus 33 centimeters, 10 to the minus 43 seconds. And so here we have the case where the mathematics that Einstein came up with is the very mathematics that comes back and says, your fundamental concept of space and time failed at 10 to the minus 33 centimeters and 10 to the minus 43 seconds. So that's how science, good science, really works. The mathematics that's intended to capture the fundamental concepts of your theory, if it's great mathematics and a great theory, will come back and show you exactly what the limits are of those fundamental concepts. So that's not self-refutation. In fact, that's why science is so powerful. When we just use informal discussion and, talking about ideas over, beer and so forth, that's one thing. But you can never find out the limit of your ideas and the limits of your theories when you have just an informal theory. And as a result, it's easy to become dogmatic and to think that you're getting close to the theory of everything, that I know the truth and you don't, and so forth. What science does is it puts a big dose of humility in there. Even a big theory like Einstein's theory of space-time, it tells you that theory is great and it stops at 10 to the minus 33 centimeters. Game over. So you need a new concept. So it's an anti-dogmatic kind of thing. So that's sort of just the kind of pushback I've gotten on this. And you can see why it would be some strong pushback, because what I'm saying is very, very uncomfortable, that we don't see reality as it is.
Yeah, and we'll circle back to the value of discovering the limits of different theories, because I'm excited to dive into that, to continue to, put a bow on
Each one of us is the deepest reality and the deepest truth and the deepest love that is possible. Most of us are spending our lives completely ignorant of who we really are. Most of my colleagues, they assume that space-time is fundamental, which is false. They assume that brain activity somehow gives rise to conscious experiences, which is false. And what they're missing is this. Space and time and objects in space and time do not exist when they're not perceived. We've mistaken a limit of our headset for an insight into the nature of reality.
There's that old saying, if a tree falls in the woods and no one sees it, does it still make a sound? But you're saying, like, does the tree even actually exist?
That's exactly right. The question then is, what's outside of our space-time headset? Science will continue to progress because we are not little 3-pound brains. We are the infinite intelligence. Each of us is infinitely precious and infinitely intelligent. Anything that you can say is perhaps ultimately trivial compared to the reality that you are. But on the other hand, you can know it not intellectually, but by being it.
Hello, beautiful beings. Welcome back to the Know Thyself podcast, where every single week we get the honor and privilege and opportunity to sit down with a brilliant mind, a deep soul, to see what we can learn more about the true nature of self and the world around us at deeper and deeper levels. My guest today has a PhD in cognitive psychology. He is a professor of cognitive sciences at UCI, whose groundbreaking research shakes the very foundations of our understanding of reality. He is an author of Visual Intelligence and The Case Against Reality. His extensive research in cognitive psychology and evolutionary game theory has made him a leading figure in the field of consciousness studies. His theory suggests that our perception of the world is not a direct representation of objective reality, but rather our brains construct reality as a user interface, almost like a desktop screen that is to a computer, in order to help us navigate the world. And it's with that, therefore, that reality is much more illusory than we potentially think it is, and that we may be even living in a simulation of sorts. Today, we're going to be exploring these ideas at depths and exploring the implications that they have about our understanding of the world and our place in it. Dr. Donald Hoffman, thank you for being here.
My pleasure. Thanks a lot for having me, Andre.
Yeah, it's my honor. I've been really loving just digesting more of your content, your books, and it's so mind-bending and opening. And I would love for you just to start out with like what the technical question that you and your team set out to kind of answer as you started on the journey that you're on.
Well, so there's a couple of strands to our research. One is evolution, and what does it entail about sensory systems? And does evolution shape sensory systems to see reality as it is or not? That's one strand of our research. And another strand is the question of consciousness. And can we as scientists get a mathematically precise model of consciousness and of its relationship to physical objects like brains and neurons and so forth? And does consciousness arise from the brain, or what is that relationship? And so those are the two strands: evolution and what it shapes sensory systems to see, and consciousness and its relationship to the physical world. And our work on evolution has focused on a technical question. Does evolution by natural selection shape sensory systems to see truths about objective reality, true structures of objective reality? And most of us would say, well, of course. I mean, it's all about fitness, and surely seeing the truth is going to make you more fit. And that seems like just a no-brainer. Sure. And many of my colleagues think that. But when you look at Darwin's theory with mathematical precision, as we can with the tools of evolutionary game theory, which was John Maynard Smith brought the tools of game theory, which is a mathematical theory, together with Darwin's ideas to give us evolutionary game theory. So we can actually now not just talk informally about what evolution does, we can actually write down mathematical equations and run simulations and so forth. And so I decided with my graduate students, including Justin Mark, Brian Marion, and others, to address this question. You know, it's a nice, clean, technical question. So what is the probability that natural selection would shape our sensory systems, any sensory systems, to see any truths about the structure of reality? And by structure, I mean, you know, for example, maybe reality has some distance metric. Things are far apart. So what is the probability that it tells us truths about distances?
or orders, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is a total order. If the real reality has some total order, what's the probability that evolution would shape our sensory systems to see that total order? And topologies and other things you can imagine. So we went at it, and I thought, maybe evolution will do things on the cheap. And so maybe every once in a while it won't show us the truth, and because you don't want to waste calories. But when we got into it, I was surprised. It turned out that the math was very, very clear. There are selection pressures against seeing the truth, period. In fact, our theorems basically tell us that the probability that any sensory system of any organism has ever been shaped to see any aspect of objective reality, any structure of objective reality, is precisely zero in the limit. Precisely zero. Zero. And intuitively, that sounds crazy, but intuitively, the reason is, I'll give a couple reasons. First, evolution shapes sensory systems to guide adaptive behavior. Any evolutionary biologist would agree with that. And basically what I'm saying is, yes, it shapes sensory systems to guide adaptive behavior, period. It doesn't shape them in addition to see truths. And that seems so counterintuitive, but that's really what evolutionary theory is telling us. And Steven Pinker talked about this in a paper of his, also in a book called How the Mind Works, but in a paper called So How Does the Mind Work? And he outlines evolutionary reasons in that beautiful paper about why there would be selection pressures against true beliefs and true perceptions. So Steve's work is brilliant, but he left open the door that we might have some true perceptions about everyday objects. So that was, my focus was about those everyday objects, like tables and chairs and the moon and the sun and so forth. And there we basically, Pinker's logic continues even for those objects. And we don't see the truth even there for everyday middle-sized objects. So I'll give a brief technical reason why, and then I'll give an informal. Technically, evolution, as formulated by evolutionary game theory, think of it as a game. And to win a game, you have to get more points, right, than your competition, for example, or enough points to get to the next level or something. So in evolutionary theory, the points are what they call payoff functions. So if I'm a lion and I'm hungry, a cow or a steak would have great payoff for me as a lion. If I'm the same lion and I'm full and I want to mate, well, a cow has no payoff for me at all, right? So there are these payoff functions that tell you roughly the evolutionary points you're going to get, which correspond to your chances of reproduction in evolutionary theory. And so these are mathematical functions. They're functions from the world, whatever the world is. The world, its state, the organism, like the lion, its particular sensory systems and its particular physiological state, like hungry or sated, and the action, feeding, fighting, fleeing, and mating, the famous 4 Fs. So it's a complicated function from the world into payoff values. Say 0 was a bad payoff to 100, which is a great payoff. It doesn't matter what the numbers are, but say 0 to 100 or 0 to 1,000. And so what we do is we actually analyze, do those fitness payoff functions actually contain information about the structures of reality? Mathematically, we'd say, are they homomorphisms of the structures of reality? That is, do they preserve these structures? And so that's what I'm working with Chetan Prakash more recently. So I did simulations, but then when we got the hint that this was what was going on, I went with a wonderful friend of mine, long-term collaborator, Chetan Prakash, who's a mathematician. And so Chetan has proven these theorems. I'm not blaming him, but And what we found is that the probability is precisely 0. There are some payoff functions that will preserve objective reality structures. There's not that there aren't any, But when you take the ratio of the number that preserve the structures of reality versus all of them, the total number of payoff functions, that ratio goes to zero as the number of states in the world and the number of payoff functions gets larger.
So would you say that what we see is connected to the structure of reality, but that the structure of reality is made up of something completely different than what we're experiencing?
Yes, it's connected, but very, very different. And so here, now I'll talk about the informal metaphor that you mentioned earlier on, which is like a user interface on your computer, right? If you're writing an email and the icon on your desktop is blue and rectangular for some email you're writing, that doesn't mean the email itself is blue and rectangular. And if the icon's in the middle of the screen, it doesn't mean your email is in the middle of your computer. I mean, anybody who thought that just misunderstands the desktop interface. It's not there to resemble the truth. It's there to hide the truth, which is diodes and resistors and magnetic fields and voltages. You're actually toggling millions of voltages in a precise sequence to write that email. If you had to do that, good luck. If you had to do it directly, if you had to see the reality and do that directly, you'd never send your email out. So the user interface allows you to interact with reality and control the reality with the kind of precision you need, even though you're utterly ignorant. Most of us have no idea about the voltages that we're toggling. We're completely ignorant about the reality that we're actually interacting with. And so that's what evolution did. Evolution gave us our senses, seeing, hearing, smelling, and so forth, as a virtual headset, so to speak. We got a headset to play the game of life, and that headset hides reality, but allows us to control objective reality in the ways that we need. So it's like if you're playing, like the Grand Theft Auto, like VR kind of analogy. Like if you're playing a multiplayer game, I might be playing with someone in China or India or whatever around the world, and I could look over with my headset on, looking over, see a red Ferrari. And my friend in China might also say, oh yeah, I see a red Ferrari. But of course, the red Ferrari is only there when I render it. When I look, the pixels appear in my headset. I then see a red Ferrari, but there's no red Ferrari in the supercomputer. And if I look away, my friend in China might say, well, I still see a red Ferrari. Well, she's seeing her red Ferrari, the one that she's creating in her conscious experience from her headset. So we have the feeling, we could have the feeling that the red Ferrari is always there, but in fact, there is no red Ferrari anywhere except in the moment of someone's perception.
So this is really fascinating, and this conversation is going to be very trippy. The Nobel Prize that was kind of recently awarded for proving that local realism is false is speaking to this, right? It's like there's that old kind of saying, if a tree falls in the woods and no one sees it, does it still make a sound? But you're saying, like, does the tree even actually exist if no one's perceiving it? So
That's right.
What are the powerful implications of proving that local realism is false? What does that mean?
Right. So that's a good point to move to, because someone might say, well, it's one thing to talk about evolution, but you're talking about objects in space-time. That's not evolutionary theory's bailiwick, that's physicists. Surely the physicists will put you in your place and tell you that you're full of it. Well, but as you said, the Nobel Prize last year in physics went to 3 physicists who had done a lot of empirical work actually verifying the predictions of quantum theory, that local realism is false. So Anton Zeilinger and John Clauser and Alan Aspect were the winners. And so local realism has 2 parts, the local and the realism. Realism is the statement that physical objects, like the electron or proton, have definite values of their properties, like position and momentum and spin. Even that's realism. So things exist, have their properties, even if they're not observed, which we all intuitively see, of course. And then local is the claim that those properties have influences that propagate through space-time no faster than the speed of light. Einstein's got the speed limit. So that's local realism. And it turns out that local realism is false. And Clauser did the first experiments decades ago and didn't get the Nobel Prize because this is the kind of stuff where you really want to nail it down. So then Aspect did some more, and then Zeilinger did some more. So after decades and decades, even the conservative body like the Nobel Committee says, okay, game's up. Local realism is false. Now, some people will say that this doesn't rule out super determinism. We can talk about that if you want. But local, I think it's very, very clear in the quantum formalism that objects do not have definite values of their properties when they're not observed. Now, some people will try to wiggle out and say, well, that's for microscopic stuff, subatomic particles and so forth, but tables and chairs, that's a different story. Well, there's no one's given a principled account that says that first, quantum theory holds at all scales. So it's just false to say that quantum theory is the theory of the small and something else is the theory. It's just false. Quantum theory is the theory, quantum field theory is the theory of physics, especially, and also gravity, Einstein's gravity. So you can't say local realism is false only for small particles, but not for everyday macroscopic objects. We can talk about, the collapse of the wave function and so forth if you want. A little more, go into the weeds on it a little bit more. But if we don't want to go into the weeds, I'll just say this is true at all scales. And so what I'm saying then is that evolution by natural selection independently agrees with what the physicists just won the Nobel Prize for. It says that what you see is not the truth. You render the objects that you see on the fly, including all their properties. And that's why local realism is false. The reason it doesn't have the properties is because it doesn't even exist. The moon exists when you perceive it. And when you don't perceive it, it doesn't exist.
So that's where I wanted to go next, because you look at these celestial entities like the moon or planets, the fact that they wouldn't exist when no conscious mind is perceiving them is a very baffling idea. How could something, you spoke to how this works at all scales, right? So it doesn't matter if it's a chair, if it's the moon, but I suppose, how do you define consciousness then? Because could you say then that the moon has a consciousness of its own? What about, is there like a scale of sentience for animal life that would perceive the moon? Can you break down more how it's actually possible that the moon doesn't exist when we don't perceive it?
Right, it's mind-bending. I think a lot of help comes if you think about the virtual reality headset. Almost all of your questions will get resolved if you think in terms of it. Okay. So just imagine that I'm in a virtual world that has the moon and the sun in virtual reality, but it's all in my headset. And I have it's a multiplayer game, so other people are, maybe I'm playing tennis, for example, and I have the tennis ball, and I'm getting it, my partner hits the tennis ball back. Well, now I could play a game and say, well, the tennis ball is real because, look, I'm going to take the tennis ball, drop it, and my partner, Mary, you still see the tennis ball? Yeah, it's still there, it's on the ground. That proves that the tennis ball was there. No, it doesn't. Mary just had her pixels in her headset. There's some supercomputer that's coordinating everything, but there's no green tennis ball inside the supercomputer. And so any questions you have, anything stumping you, just think about a multiplayer virtual reality game, take your question into that, and you will then see how to answer your own questions. I usually like to give that metaphor now because people send me emails all the time, and I find myself always saying, okay, here's the virtual reality headset metaphor. When you think about it in that case, you get the right answer every time. So, but now your question is also about what is consciousness, and for example, we might say that a rock isn't conscious, but maybe an amoeba, I don't know, maybe an ant, I don't know, but maybe by the time we get to a mouse, possibly conscious, or a cat. That tends to be our intuition. But again, that isn't listening to what our best science is telling us. Space and time, and objects in space and time, do not exist when they are perceived. It's just a headset. So, the distinction that we make between living and non-living is not principle. It's an artifact of the limitation of the headset. The distinction we make between conscious and unconscious is not principle. It's also an artifact. I'll give you an example to bring that home. Suppose you're on a Zoom discussion with somebody, and you see the face of your friend. There's some pixels So two. And then also a wall or a chair behind it. Well, you might say, well, some of the pixels are conscious. The pixels related to, those are conscious pixels. And the pixels for the desk and the chair are not conscious. Well, that's so. Pixels are just pixels. Sometimes they give you insights about consciousness in a person's face and expression, but sometimes they don't. The chair and the desk. But pixels are neither conscious nor unconscious. And this is all headset. So all you're seeing are the pixels. When you're looking around, you're just seeing the pixels. And the distinction you make between living and non-living, conscious and unconscious, is not principled. It's an artifact of the limitations of your headset. So in my view, then, see, the physicists have said, quantum theory tells us that physical particles don't have properties when they're not observed. Okay. And then high energy theoretical particle physicists like David Gross, Nima Hamed, and others they're at the very forefront of physics, looking, okay, well, what's next? What they're saying, and this is a quote, is space-time is doomed. Space-time itself is not fundamental. It's been space and time under Newton was the foundation of reality. And then since Einstein in 1905, space-time has been, in science, the fundamental reality. But now, in 2023, it's over. It's had a good ride. Space and time have had a good ride. They were a very, very useful assumption. But now science has moved on. Space-time is not fundamental. And physicists are finding new structures beyond space-time, something like the decorated permutations or mathematical structures beyond space-time. But they don't know what this means. They're finding mathematical structures, but what is it beyond space-time? So what I'm pursuing with this other strand of our research is the idea that consciousness is fundamental. And consciousness is the reality beyond space-time. In fact, space-time just is a pretty trivial headset. That certain consciousness is probably not most, probably very few consciousnesses used. So I'm proposing a complete inversion of how we think about space and time and consciousness. And most of us think of space and time as fundamental, and you are a little body, 100 to 200 pound, 300 pound body in space-time, and 3 pounds of brain create consciousness. So that's the standard of thought. But that doesn't match our best science. Our best science is saying space-time is not fundamental. Local realism falls. Space-time is just a headset. Whose headset? I'm proposing, let's turn it around. Consciousness is fundamental. Space-time is a trivial data structure, a trivial headset. And it's only got 4 dimensions, 3 of space, 1 of time, and string theory maybe at 10 or 11. Why not 20 billion? I mean, actually space-time falls apart at 10 to the minus 33 centimeters. It falls, that's what physicists will say. It doesn't even have any meaning, operational meaning, past 10 to the minus 30. So not 10 to the minus 33 trillion centimeters, just 10 to the minus 33. The thing falls apart. So if you thought that space and time are the fundamental reality, you're a cheap headset. A really, really cheap headset.
A very enchanting cheap headset. It feels very real. Yeah. So, I mean, we just opened up so much here, and I'm so excited to spend the rest of this podcast breaking down and digesting a lot of this, especially in the later part of this conversation, exploring some of the moral, ethical implications of all this. But first, I want to kind of go back to this distinction between consciousness and what's alive and what's not. We, I think, like to kind of separate our thinking from a human is conscious, maybe a rock isn't conscious, certainly less conscious. Is an electron alive? Would you say that an electron is alive or conscious, or is alive and conscious two separate things in your view?
Well, so when I look at you, I just have a visual experience of a human body. That visual experience is not alive. That's just my visual experience, and it's not you. You are a conscious entity, and my experience of you is just my experience through my headset. And so I would say that the image that I have of you, my perception, that is neither alive nor not alive. It's just a portal to your consciousness, and it's it's one of the best portals I have. The human form, in my perception, is one of the best portals I have into consciousness. The cat form is a portal, but not quite as good. I can tell when my cat is hungry, or if I've petted it enough and it's had enough, But with an ant, a little bit about it's alive for sure, and a little bit about what it likes and dislikes. So, but when I get to a rock, I might say, well, it's totally unconscious. No, it just means that my interface to the thought. I'm always, so the idea is, I'm always interacting with consciousness. My headset has limitations. With humans, it gives me some, but not very good. Actually, you could live with someone for many, many years and still have lots of stuff you don't know about their conscious experience, how they see the world. You can still be surprised. So we've mistaken a limit of our headset for an insight into the nature of reality. I see a rock, it looks pretty dumb to me, but it's not because I'm interacting with a dumb reality, it's because my headset has to give up. It's simplifying things, it's dumbing things down. So when I'm interacting, I'll be very, very quick. When I pick up a rock, I am interacting with consciousness. And I'm not saying the rock is conscious, right? I'm not saying the rock is conscious. The rock is just my experience. So for example, let's do the VR metaphor again with ground drift auto. When I grab the steering wheel of my car, right, I'm doing something inside the computer, but there's no steering wheel inside the computer. Right? So that's the key thing to keep. I'm always, in that metaphor, I'm always interacting with diodes and resistors and voltages. That's what I'm always doing. Sometimes I see those diodes and resistors as a steering wheel. Sometimes I see them as a Ferrari. Sometimes I see them as my arm, my avatar arm. But I'm always interacting with the diodes and resistors in that metaphor. So now, backing it into it, I'm saying consciousness is the fundamental engine. It's the supercomputer behind everything. And everything that I see is my interaction with that engine, with consciousness. But my headset dumbs things down. So with you, I'm getting insight into the consciousness that I'm interacting with my cat, but with a rock not. But it's just wrong to say the rock is unconscious and your body is conscious. Those are just, put it this way, the body that I'm perceiving is not you. It's just the body that I'm perceiving. Yeah. And for all I know, if you actually knew what I was perceiving of you, you would say, no, that's not what I think I look like at all.
Right.
So.
Yep. I mean, so much of the world, and I'm excited to dive into this a little bit later, so much division and separation comes from the tightly held beliefs of our perceptions being the absolute truth, right? And so
that's right.
This view of consciousness being fundamental is a completely 180 shift from how most people even approach the hard problem, right? And
absolutely.
We think that at some stage of neuronal development, we turn that dial enough and then we get conscious experience by virtue of unconscious complexity just kind of developing. But if consciousness is fundamental, then you're coming at the problem, if you want to call it that, from the completely opposite angle.
That's exactly right. So most of my colleagues who are studying consciousness, good friends and colleagues, and they're brilliant, but most of them are physicalists. They assume that space-time is fundamental, which is false. They assume that reductionism is true, which is false. They assume that brain activity, or, for example, complicated enough artificial intelligence systems, right up to the computers, somehow gives rise to conscious experiences. So that's the standard view. And again, these are my friends and colleagues. They're brilliant. But they've failed so far to explain any specific conscious experience. There's no scientific theory none, that can explain a specific conscious experience and how it arises from the brain activity. Orchestrated collapse of neuronal microtubular quantum states, or integrated information, or some global workspace architecture. If you ask them, and I've done this, these are my friends. Okay? I'll ask them informally, I'll ask them at conferences when I want to put them on the spot. Let's say, so great, we have a theory of consciousness, so what specific conscious experience can you explain? What is the integrated information theory pattern, what they call the Q shape, that must be the taste of chocolate and couldn't be the smell of garlic? What is it? or whatever one you want. Can you give me one? And I've done this with Stuart Hammeroff and with this Penrose. Stuart, can you give me a specific conscious experience that you're going to come? And I had to push 2 or 3 minutes. He hemmed and hawed, and I thought, Stuart, can you give me one? And I was saying, no, you can't. And it's not because they're dumb, they're brilliant. But you can't boot up consciousness from space-time objects. It's just not possible. And so spiritual traditions have been saying this for thousands of years, right? They've been saying that consciousness is fundamental in space and time. They haven't used the term headset, but it's an illusion or something. And Plato has the allegory of the cave. And so the spiritual traditions have, in some sense, been there for quite a while, but they haven't had the tools of mathematics. They've had only imprecise language to it. And they also haven't had the tools of experimental psychology, for example, or experimental science more generally. So we're coming to a nice convergence for humanity. The spiritual traditions have been saying this for thousands of years, but haven't had the tools to make it rigorous. And they've suffered for that, because when you only have words, the words, they'll say the words are just pointers to Tao. The Jing starts off the very first sentence is the Tao that can be spoken is not the true Tao. Once you understand that, then it's fine. You can read the rest of the book and realize, don't take this stuff literally. Just take it as pointers to the truth inside you, consciousness inside you. And any good spiritual tradition will make that distinction clear up front. But the followers have famously, terribly misunderstood that to the end of religious wars, persecutions, killings, and so forth. And a lot of that comes because we've had imprecise language, and it's easy to become dogmatic and to not understand the limits. So what we have coming with science now is the scientists are now saying, okay, we need to look outside of space-time. And the spiritual traditions are saying, well, great, we've been here for quite a while, come join us. But now the scientists have these incredible tools. They thought that they were studying reality. They've been studying their headset. We've been studying the space-time headset since Galileo. But we got good enough that we actually discovered that it's just a headset, right? It's actually the tools of science that have forced us to recognize that space-time is just a headset.
Which is an incredible achievement.
It's unbelievable. And that's what is so beautiful about the science, is that the theories are mathematically precise, so that they tell you 2 things. They tell you the scope, the power of your theory with mathematical precision. But even more important, they tell you the limits. This is how far your theory goes and then it stops. And that's the point of mathematical theories. They tell you the scope and the limits of the foundational concepts of your theories. And so going forward now, I think that science will get a really mathematically precise theory of consciousness. I'm working with my team. We can talk about what I'm working on if you want. But I should make a point here that many philosophers have argued against what I'm saying they'll say, look, and this has been published in scientific philosophy journals, for example. And so a number of philosophers have said, Hoffman is saying that he's using evolutionary game theory, the mathematics, to show that organisms and resources, objects in space and time, are not fundamental. They're an illusion, that we don't see reality as it is. Well, now Darwin, in his theory, was proposing real physical objects competing for real physical resources in space and time. So the philosophers will say, well, now look, now either the mathematics of evolutionary game theory faithfully represents Darwin's theory, or it doesn't. Now, if it doesn't, you couldn't possibly use it to show that space and time and physical objects aren't fundamental. And if it does faithfully represent Darwin's theory, then it wouldn't contradict Darwin's theory. And Darwin's theory assumes space and time and physical objects. So either way, you're in a bad situation, what they will call an unenviable dialectical position. The philosopher like to use that language. So an undesirable dialectical position that you put yourself in. Either way, you can't possibly. So they're saying basically you couldn't use evolutionary game theory in principle to show that space and time and physical objects aren't fundamental. And what they're missing is this. The mathematics, as it's used in science, is built on the assumptions of the theory. And it shows you the scope of those assumptions, but also the limits. And there will be limits. No, there is no theory of everything. In principle, there is no scientific theory of everything, because you always have to have assumptions. And so you have a theory of everything except for your assumptions, but the assumptions are the miracles of your theory. Now, so what happens then is, just to make a real clear example of this, because this really seems to have grasped the imagination of a lot of philosophers and people who are philosophically minded. They think I'm in a logically bad situation. I've shot myself in the foot logically. Einstein and his theory of space-time. He had the intuitions about space and time and gravity warping space and time. He wrote them down in mathematics, right? So, for example, in 1907, he had the idea that if he was in an elevator and it was falling, he was in an elevator and standing on a scale. He weighs 150 pounds. And then you cut the cord of the elevator and it goes in free fall. All of a sudden, Einstein realized I'd weigh nothing. And that was his big insight. That was the big insight that led to his theory of gravity. It took him several years, until like 1915, to actually turn it into mathematics. Well, so now that we have Einstein's intuition and his own mathematics to make it formal, and also his mathematics for quantum theory. When we put them together, we find out that space-time ceases to have any operational meaning at what's called the Planck scale, 10 to the minus 33 seconds, 10 to the minus 43 seconds. So there we see that Einstein himself, with his own mathematics that were formalizing his own intuitions, comes up with mathematics that tells him the limits of his intuition. The limits are 10 to the minus 33 centimeters, 10 to the minus 43 seconds. Space-time no longer makes sense. That's the way science works. So it's not that the mathematics will always confirm and show you that your theory has infinite extension and everything is right. It will tell you the limit. So, and what we have to do then in science, and this is maybe really important, our theories will tell us the limits. A good theory. A bad theory won't. It's not precisely what it will tell you. A really good theory will tell you this is the limit. But it can't tell you what's next. It can't tell you. So scientists then have to take the leap. A creative leap. And it's usually the younger generation, like the old guys. They die with their theories. And the younger generation then makes the new leaps. And so you have to make a leap. Most of our leaps are wrong. Most of them are not interesting. But every once in a while, you get something that's interesting. How do you know that it's interesting? Well, here's where our old theories help us. For example, in the case of space-time. Physicists are now, just in the last 10 years, literally just in the last 10 years, finding new structures utterly outside of space-time. Completely outside of the headset. But they can project them back into the headset and see what they predict inside the headset. And there, if you make predictions that aren't matching our theories inside space and time, and the data that we have inside space-time, then whatever you propose outside space-time, bye-bye. That's wrong. So our theories, our current theories inside space-time, can give us a thumbs down on our leaps outside of space-time. Say, no, dumb, bad, you got this wrong, you got that wrong. And they may give you some hints, maybe they might put your intuitions about where to look, but they can't tell you what's going to be happening. So you always have to make this creative leap, project back into space-time or into your domain of a theory, and then see So that's how science works. You take your intuitions, make them mathematically precise. 99% of the time, you're not even interesting. It's just wrong. But every once in a while, you get lucky. You get an Einstein or a Newton or something like that, and you get something that is not right, but it's interesting. It's actually it accounts for a lot of data. It's doing something right. And then when you find the limits of that, and then you have to take a creative leap, get a deeper theory. The older theories then say thumbs down most of the time, but every once in a while they'll say can't put a thumbs down, so maybe you should pursue that. Maybe that one's worth pursuing. So that's sort of the top.
All right, lots to unpack there as well. Before we move on to some of these topics in further depth, I want to kind of just go back to how fitness speaks truth and how evolution essentially hid the truth of objective reality so that we could continue on this reproduction, evolutionary wheel for its own evolutionary purposes. So can you speak to just the process of how what we perceived is created in our VR headset and how we really just see what we need to see in order long enough in order to survive and procreate?
Right. So just looking at evolutionary theory by itself, so forgetting my consciousness stuff for a moment. So when we talk about science, we have to sort of talk about what modeling is going to be. Yeah. So I'll now go back into space-time. So I'm now thinking inside of space-time. I'm using the tools of evolution. Okay. So that's the modeling. So evolution then will say very, very interesting thing. It will say, for example, that our perceptions are driven by our needs for food, mating, and so forth, and also to do things on the cheap, right? For every calorie that you spend in perception, for example, you need to go out there and kill something to eat it to get those calories, and then you put yourself at risk. So there's going to be selection pressures to do things on the cheap, to do them fairly quickly, and we get what we call satisficing solutions from the evolutionary theory. You just need a solution that's good enough most of the time. Just better than the competition, basically. You just have to be a little bit better than. So it's not that it's not really survival of the perfectly fit. It's just the survival of the fitter. Really, it's actually better to say the survival of the fitter than the fittest. You don't need to be as fit as possible. You just need to be, as long as you're better than competition, that's good enough from an evolutionary point of view. So from that point of view, the selection pressure is really just driven by the nature of your competition. And we do things on the cheap. So I'll give a fun example. So there's this Beamng out back in Australia, the jewel. And the beetles are dimpled, glossy, and hard. The males fly, the females are flightless. The males fly around looking for females. And if the male finds one that looks eligible, he alights and mates. But in the outback, there's also Homo sapiens, and the males of the species tend to drink these beers that in these bottles they call stubbies, little brown bottles, and the guys tend to throw them out in the desert. And it turns out that these bottles are dimpled, glossy, in just the right shade of brown to catch the fancy of the jewel beetles, the male jewel beetles. And so these male jewel beetles land on the bottles and try to mate. And the real females are not interested compared to these bottles. So this is the male giving the female through the bottle kind of situation for beetles. And what's interesting is these male beetles have full body contact with the bottle, and they still are agog with this bottle. And so
leaving the woman for the bottle.
Leaving the woman, the female for the bottle. So that gives you a real clue about what's going on in evolution. You think about it. Those beetles have been around for hundreds of thousands of years. The males have found females and successfully mated. You would think that evolution had taught the male what a female really is. Apparently not. Apparently what evolution gave the male was a little hack. A female is anything dimpled, glossy, and brown. The bigger the better. That was what, and that's all evolution. Something like that is all evolution gave. That's all the insight the males had about the females. The females might complain about them. They have very little insight into me at all. But that's what evolution does. It gives you just what you need to survive long enough to reproduce. And as long as there weren't these glossy bottles in the environment, the little algorithm looked for something dimpled, glossy and brown, the bigger the better, was just fine for the, that's all the insight he had into a female, that's all he needed, and that was enough to get the next generation going. But one bottle, or a few bottles in the desert, is enough to actually drive the whole species to extinction. So that gives you a clue about how evolution works. We have these simple tricks and hacks. In humans and in other species, there are things called supernormal stimulus. So again, I'm just speaking about just evolution on its own terms, which is I love evolution, evolutionary biology and evolutionary game theory. Even though I think it's not, since space-time is not fundamental, and evolution by natural selection is a theory inside space-time, ultimately, evolution by natural selection is not a deep theory. It's only a headset theory. But it's a beautiful headset theory, and I use it a lot, and this is a lot of fun. I'm looking forward to a deeper theory outside that will project down to evolutionary theory. And we can talk about that.
Yeah, I'm excited to spend more time outside the headset in a moment.
That's right. But inside the headset, there are things called supernormal stimuli. Once you understand how, so for example, the big bottle was a supernormal stimulus for the beetle, the male beetles. He liked the beetles like the bottle more than the real thing, more than a real female. So that was what we call a supernormal stimulus. And for there are some birds that like bigger eggs, and you put a big rock, and they will ignore their own eggs and sit on the rock, and they never figure it out. So that's a supernormal stimulus for them. And with humans, makeup. When women put on makeup, for example, or men, it works because of supernormal stimulus. You put red lipstick on, you're seeing lips that never occur in that color in nature. And yet, if it's done right, if you don't go to the clown, the level of a clown, done right, it's a supernormal stimulus that actually makes you look better than anything that's real. And so in humans, we use makeup and clothing and so forth to tap in, unconsciously, into the supernormal stimuli. And some of the consulting I've done for companies is to be explicit about it and help them in selling jeans and marketing and so forth. Once you know the stuff, you can play people.
Right. Yeah. Very interesting. Can you dive into how the role of conscious agents and how that plays into your theory? Just to explain what that is. What does that mean when you say conscious agents?
Right. So the question then is, what's outside of our space-time headset?
Yeah.
And no one knows. The physicists are looking, but they're just looking and they're finding mathematical structures. And so I'm proposing with my team that consciousness is fundamental, and that space and time is just a user interface that some consciousness is used. And so now as a scientist not enough to say it's consciousness, right? You have to say, okay, here's my mathematical model. And it's got to be an absolutely precise mathematical model. So we've published several papers where we have this mathematical model we call it a theory of conscious agents. And those who are interested in it, I've got a paper called Objects of Consciousness. Just Google my name and Objects of Consciousness. You'll find it online as free. And also Fusions of Consciousness. So Google my name and Fusions of Consciousness. And you can see the mathematical model. But the idea, so we have what's called a Markovian dynamics. So it's a dynamical system of conscious agents. And the intuition, so I'm not going to go into the math unless you want to go into math, but the intuition is, think of it as like a vast social network, like Twitter. We'll talk Twitter. So millions of Twitter users, billions of tweets. No one can keep up with it, but it's a vast social network. So in this, our mathematical model of consciousness is like that. It's a bunch of conscious agents in a network.
Bye.